Hello and welcome to another edition of Proselytize or Apostatize. I'm your host, David Russell, along with my co-host, David Paulman. What's up, David?
Doing awesome, Russell. How are you?
Doing all right. Now, we're going to have to go by our last names here because we got three Davids, and one of the Davids told me that the limit of Davids that are allowed to be on a podcast is only two. So we're going to go by last name. I'll be Russell, you'll be Paulman, and David Johnson will be Johnson. So we have two special guests here with us today. We have Evan Minton, who was on last week of Cerebral Faith, and we have David Johnson on, who is the owner of Skeptics and Seekers, the podcast. So I'm going to start with you, Evan, since you've already introduced yourself here last week. Tell us a little bit about your website and so forth and how you got started in it all.
Yeah, my website is cerebralfaith.net, formerly cerebralfaith.blogspot.com, but I've upgraded. It's a website that is it's got more to it. It started out as just a blog, but now there's a podcast, and hopefully I'm hoping to someday move to YouTube and start making YouTube channels like David Paulman does on his Faith Because of Reason channel, and like Inspiring Philosophy does, and Capturing Christianity. I got into apologetics when I was about 18 years old, and I'm turning 28 this year, so it's been a full decade. And I started to when I was a new Christian and I was trying to share my faith with unbelievers, and they would just pelter me with questions and objections and arguments that I just couldn't answer. Like every time I shared the gospel, they would bring up things like the problem of evil, or why I should believe in the Christian God instead of Zeus and Thor and Aphrodite, and why did God kill the Canaanites, and just all sorts of stuff. And it really sent me into a deep valley of doubt. I prayed about it. I prayed, God, if you're real, I know you don't want me to go to hell. If I don't believe in you, I'll go to hell. And if the Bible is true and you're real, then you don't want that. So I'm asking you to please help me continue to believe in you. And so he did that, and that's because just like a week later, or 2 weeks, it was very short. It was within a month. I can't remember the precise time period. I discovered Lee Strobel's works, The Case for Christ, The Case for a Creator, The Case for Faith. And I was just blown away at how much actual good evidence there is for Christianity. Because before that, I had believed that Christianity was true on the basis of religious experience, or what William Lane Craig would call the inner witness of the Holy Spirit. But I never actually had a solid, evidential, rational ground for belief. And I found it, and I was like, wow, I've got to study this stuff, and I've got to tell other people about what I've learned. And that eventually led to me founding Cerebral Faith and writing all these blog posts and doing all these podcast episodes, and that's what led up to me doing this debate today.
A true statement. I was on a debate this week on the Kalam a little bit, so I was looking up something, and lo and behold, I see Evan Minton on Cross-Examine, Frank Turek's site. So you wrote for him a little bit too, huh?
Yeah. Jorge Gill, he is one of the people who runs the website. Facebook, I'm Facebook friends with him. I actually got to stay the weekend at his house one weekend during the National Conference on Christian Apologetics back in 2017. Great guy. He emailed me he messaged me on Facebook and said, hey, would you like to write some articles for crossexamine.org? And I was like, yeah, well, how should I do this? And he said, just keep blogging like you usually do. I'll just pick one every now and then from your website and feature it. And I was like, okay. So every now and then I get a pleasant surprise, like, oh, one of my articles was featured.
Nice. Yeah, that's really cool. Well, thanks for being on with us today, Evan. I'm going to go to you, David. Tell us a little bit about Skeptics and Seekers for my audience. I know what it's about. And let us know how you got started in that.
Let's see. Well, I got started with Skeptics and Seekers a couple of years ago, I want to say. It's been on a year and a half. But a couple of years ago, Justin Brierly wrote his magnus opus, why he remained a Christian after 10 years of debating with atheists, something like that. And a team of my friends got together and we wrote a response book to that called Still Unbelievable, Why After 10 Years of Listening to Unbelievable, We Remain Unconvinced, or something like that. I actually don't remember the name of it, but that's pretty close. And so we put that out, and we had kind of made Justin Brierley an unofficial member of the Still Unbelievable book team. And so when we got that out and published, it was kind of a no-brainer for Justin to invite a couple of us on the show and have a battle of the books. And that's a big audience, that's a big stage when you get a chance to get on the Unbelievable. So, here we'd been listening to the show for many years, and now we had wormed our way on the show somehow.
Nice.
And so after that, we found ourselves talking about different ways that, maybe we could capitalize on that. We have lots of ideas and things that we'd like to do. What can we do that can capitalize on that 15 minutes of fame of having been on Unbelievable? And so one of the things, we tried out a few of the podcast ideas that we had in mind. We both took one of them as it happens, and we kind of went our own way and built our own network. I took Skeptics and Seekers and ran with it. My idea for Skeptics and Seekers was to be something similar to Unbelievable, where Christians and non-believers got together in discussion. But the flaw I saw in Unbelievable is that despite what Justin does to make it fair, it's still a Christian show. It's a Christian show. And sometimes it's two Christians debating with Justin as the host. Sometimes it's a Christian and atheist, but Justin's still a host. It's still a Christian show at the end of the day. And I wanted a show that was not a Christian show or an atheist show. And I wanted a full-time Christian co-host to go along with that, so that it's a Christian and atheist together, sharing duties equally. It wasn't just going to be some token Christian who had to respond to me every week. He would have equal say in the content. One week it would be his subject, next week it would be mine. We had blogs that we did every week. And so we did everything that we could to make it completely egalitarian, so that the audience, all audiences from faith to non-faith, could feel confident that this is a show where no one had their thumb on the scale. And so we've been running for about a year and a half now. This summer it'll be 2 years.
That's awesome. So, gentlemen, tonight we're going to be talking a little bit about the Kalam, and we agreed on a format with 12-minute opening statements. But I first wanted to ask y'all a personal question. How you guys surviving this pandemic right now? And just go ahead, just chime in, any of you.
Oh, it's kind of. I'm a bit of an introvert. I spend a lot of time inside anyway, but so I didn't really notice it at first. But then with the shutdown, and now I'm forced to stay home. I can't go out ever, even to work or play or anything else. And my cousin, she's been helping me out, running all the doing all the groceries, getting medicine, so I don't have to expose myself to the that sounds wrong to the elements. But at this stage of the game, I'm starting to feel like a hermit. I actually I would like to go to the grocery store just so I can be outside of these four walls. I walk around my house. I don't live very close to. I live in a very wooded area, so I just kind of walk around the house a little bit, get some sunshine, just make sure I don't get scurvy.
Get that good old southern sun, huh?
Yeah.
All right. So Johnson, how's everything going for you?
I live in New Jersey, man. This is Death Central. We're just outside of New York, which is also Death Central. And so, the pandemic is very real here. Yeah. I am also hermit. I think that's true of a lot of people who are on the internet. So we are all the same kind of geek in some ways. And so it's not like we were the most socially adept people anyway, otherwise we wouldn't be spending so much time on the internet. That said, It's tough. I think it's not so much about my lifestyle, the changes in my lifestyle, but just the underlying fear of walking down a sidewalk and having a person come down the other way, and there's a person and you're going to pass. And is this going to be the moment that you get the coronavirus? Oh no, that fool doesn't have a mask. All right, I'm going to walk out in the street here. It's a time when I just feel very paranoid, and the enemy is the other, all of the other. And so
Yeah.
I never really liked people all that much in the first place, and now I'm just downright scared of them. And there's probably going to be a lot of therapists who would like to have a crack at me once this is all over. But yeah, I'm a little bit of a basket case here, because it is a very real thing here. It's not a theoretical thing here. New York is celebrating, that they're down to about 500 deaths a day. And the last time I looked at New Jersey, we were moving up past 300 deaths a day. I mean, I figure we might meet at 400. That's a lot of people dying every day, and some of the worst of it is near where I live. So it's just a very real thing that it used to be funny until it came here, and now I don't know what to do with it now.
Yeah. And David, you are in New York, so tell us a little about what's going on up there.
Well, it's been exciting. As David Johnson said, it is probably the worst in my state right now. Unfortunately, people just don't really seem to be respecting the lockdown, and so we've got a lot of people coming out, and like people going on like biking adventures past the house and stuff the other day, just like a whole pack of them. So that's part of the problem, and then just people compacted together. I mean, it's going down-ish, or maybe leveling out is a better word. But in any case, it seems like it's not on the rise as much, but obviously it's still very much here. So just it is bad here.
Yeah, and it's real here too, up in near the DC area. I work in Arlington, and we had one of our guards test positive for the virus. And now we have to do 20,000 extra procedures to be able to arm up and to do our job. We have to all wear the personal protective gear like 24/7 or the entire time we're there. So yeah, it's pretty real. And I hear you guys, and I wanted to spend a little bit of time on that because this is a real time, and it's something that we can all come together and say, hey, yeah, this is a scary time. Stay indoors. Follow the CDC guidelines and stuff like that. So I just did want to put that out there, and let's get into this. Let's get into the Kalam Cosmological Argument. I was on a debate not too long ago, probably a little over a year ago, and it got me thinking about the current state of the Kalam. So that's kind of like where I'm at. So I love cosmological arguments. So I was like, hey, why don't we debate the Kalam again? And then move to teleology after that, So I'm going to let Evan go first, since he is the affirming, and then David will follow with his opening statements, and they're both 12 minutes each. And then we're going to go into maybe rebuttals if they choose to after this, or we could just jump into conversation. But the 12 minutes for you, Evan, starts whenever you speak your first word for the argument.
Okay. So first of all, thank you guys for having me on the show tonight. Like you said, I'm going to be defending the beginning of the universe because I believe it's a very powerful piece of evidence for the existence of God. And I'm not going to spend, I'm just going to jump right into it, make sure I can cram everything in. So the first piece of evidence for the origin of the universe is the Big Bang Theory. Albert Einstein in the early 1900s presented his general theory of relativity. Einstein's equations predicted a universe that was either in a constant state of expansion or contraction. Einstein wasn't fond of the implications of his theory, so he added a fudge factor to his theory to avoid those implications. During the 1920s, the Russian mathematician Alexander Friedmann and the Belgian astronomer Georges Lemaitre managed to independently formulate mathematical models of the universe that predicted an expansion. After that, in 1929, the American astronomer Edwin Hubble discovered that the light coming from the distant galaxies appeared to be redder than they should have been. Now, what do I mean when I say that Edwin Hubble saw that the light from the distant galaxies appeared redder than they should have been? In physics, a redshift is when light or other electromagnetic radiation from something has a wavelength that is stretched to the point that its light goes to the red side of the light spectrum. The galactic shifts are an example of the Doppler effect. The Doppler effect is a change in frequency or wavelength of either light or sound caused by the motion of the source itself to the observer of the source. Let me give an example of the Doppler effect in action. Let's say you're standing on the side of the road and you hear a race car approaching at a constant speed. As the car gets closer and closer to you, the pitch or tone of the engine sounds the same. But once the car passes you, the pitch of the engine changes and sounds lower than it did when it was approaching you. This is because as the car approaches you, the sound waves are closer and closer together, shorter wavelength. But as it moves away from you, the sound waves are farther apart, longer wavelength. Well, Hubble noticed the same sort of stretching in the light shining from the distant galaxies. Since the light waves were being stretched, Hubble concluded that the galaxies are moving away from us. And the reason they're moving away from us is that the universe is expanding. Now, for the first time, we finally had empirical evidence that was previously predicted by the theoretical work of Einstein, Friedman, and Lemaitre. This had astounding implications. The fact that the universe is expanding meant that the universe had an absolute beginning. How so? Because if the universe is getting bigger and bigger and bigger as it gets older and older and older, then it must have been smaller and smaller and smaller in the past. In the film, The Case for a Creator, produced by Illustra Media, Lee Strobel gives an illustration that is very helpful in understanding the implications of an expanding universe. Imagine the expansion of the universe is being played on a film projector. As the film runs forward, you see the universe expand as all of the matter and energy grows farther apart as time moves forward. The universe would get bigger and bigger and bigger as the film continues to run forward. But what would happen if you press the rewind button on the projector? In this case, you would see the universe get smaller and smaller and smaller until the universe becomes smaller than the period at the end of a sentence in a book. Rewind the expansion even farther back than that, and the universe reaches a point of infinite density, which is just another way to say that it began from nothing. This conclusion was drawn by what scientists call backward extrapolation. The universe began expanding from a point of infinite density about 14 billion years ago in a violent and rapid explosion-like expansion. This event that marked the beginning of the universe was dubbed by Fred Hoyle the Big Bang Theory. So we have an abundance of scientific evidence for the Big Bang Theory. Now, aside from the theoretical and empirical evidence for the universe's expansion, there are other pieces of evidence for the Big Bang as well. For example, the abundance of light elements in the universe supports the Big Bang Theory. Astrophysicists Deborah and Lauren Harzma explain in their book Origins that, quote, a major piece of evidence is the amount of helium in the universe. The ordinary matter in the universe is about 75% hydrogen, 24% helium, and 1% other elements. Why this percentage and not some other ratio? Even in a universe billions of years old, the fusion in stars happens much too slowly to account for this much helium. Using the Big Bang model, astrophysicists calculate that the conditions of the universe are about 3 minutes after the Big Bang were very similar to the interior of a star and just right for fusion reactions. The temperature density of the hydrogen gas allowed it to fuse into helium and into trace amounts of deuterium and lithium. The calculations of the Big Bang model even make precise predictions for the relative percentages of helium, deuterium, and lithium that would be produced. The model predicts that about 24% of the gas would be helium, in agreement with what astronomers observe, end quote. And moreover, in the 1960s, Arno Penzias and Robert Wilson discovered the cosmic microwave background radiation using the Holmdel antenna. This was a fulfillment of a prediction made by the Standard Big Bang model. Standard Big Bang model predicted that if the universe began to exist and it was in a hot, dense state about 14 billion years ago, then there should be leftover radiation from that explosion-like expansion, and that is exactly what has been discovered. Now, aside from all the scientific evidence that I've talked about, there are good philosophical arguments that the universe began to exist. And I plan on perhaps heavily focusing on these arguments throughout tonight's debate, because I have come to conclude that every single eternal universe model that has ever been proposed and is currently being proposed suffers from logical incoherence for exactly the same reasons. Therefore, even if they're all perfectly fine, mathematically, physically, empirically, they look good on paper, nevertheless, if they are logically incoherent, they cannot possibly be true, and they must be discarded. I affirm that not only did the universe have a beginning, but an eternal universe is metaphysically impossible. Thus, although I believe that the universe began to exist on the basis of scientific evidence, I also believe them on the basis of philosophical arguments. Let me get into those two philosophical arguments. The first philosophical argument is that the existence of an actually infinite number of things is impossible because various absurdities would result if they existed. Doug Powell gives an interesting example on page 30 of his Holman Quicksource Guide to Christian Apologetics. Let's say I had an actually infinite number of CDs in my collection. Let's say I wanted to give you some. Let's say that I gave you all of the CDs in my collection. How many CDs would I have? The answer? 0. But now let's say that I gave you all of the CDs with odd numbers on them. In this case, you would have all of the CDs with odd numbers on them, and I would have all of the CDs with even numbers on them. How many CDs would I have left? Infinitely many. You would have an infinite number of odd numbered CDs, and I would have an infinite number of even numbered CDs. But now let's say I wanted to give you all of the CDs with the number 4 and greater written on them. In this case, how many CDs would I have left? 3. In the first scenario, infinity minus infinity is 0. In the second scenario, infinity minus infinity is infinity. In the third scenario, infinity minus infinity is 3. In all three scenarios, we've subtracted the same number from the same number and have arrived at different results. In fact, you can subtract infinity from infinity and arrive at any number from 0 to infinity. This is absurd. This just shows that infinity is a concept that exists in our minds, not something that exists in reality. Now, second argument. Before I go on to that, let me say that if an actually infinite number of things cannot exist, then an eternal universe cannot exist. Because 1, an actually infinite number of things cannot exist. 2, an eternal universe requires an actually infinite number of things, i.e. past moments. 3, therefore, an eternal universe cannot exist. Next philosophical argument. You cannot traverse an actually infinite number of things. Even if you wanted to discard the previous philosophical argument, the second one, you can't. You cannot form an infinite number of things by adding one after another. For example, let's say there's an infinite number of dominoes all lined up in a row, and all of those dominoes are the color white, except for the last one, which is the color red. The red domino will never fall over. Why? Because before the red domino could fall over, the white domino before it had to fall over. Before that domino could fall over, the one before it had to fall over. And before that domino could fall over, the one before it would have to fall over, and so on and so on and so on. The red domino would never fall over because an infinite number of dominoes would have to fall first. In fact, not only would the red domino never fall over, but no individual white domino in the entire infinite series would fall over. Each domino would have an infinite number of dominoes preceding it that had to fall first. So none of the dominoes could fall over. So, what imagine that the dominoes represent past events. In an eternal universe, an actually infinite number of past events would have had to arrive. And in my illustration, the red domino represents today. Well, obviously, if the universe is past eternal, we couldn't have reached today, because before today could dawn, yesterday had to dawn, and before yesterday could dawn, the day before it would have to dawn, and so on and so on and so on. No single moment in the entire infinite series could come to pass, because each would have an infinite number of dominoes that preceded it. Now, if the red domino fell over, my conclusion would be that there were only a finite number of dominoes in the set. Somewhere back in the set of dominoes, there was a first domino, and something started the whole process. We therefore have both scientific evidence and philosophical arguments for the beginning of the universe. So, as I said near the beginning of my opening statement, I believe that the fact that the universe began to exist is powerful evidence for the existence of God. Allow me to unpack that in the form of a syllogistic argument. 1.
30 seconds.
Whatever begins to exist has a cause. 2. The universe began to exist. 3. Therefore, the universe has a cause. Since I don't have a whole lot of time, I'm just going to assume that Mr. Johnson agrees with the first premise, that things that come into being from nothing cannot come into being from nothing, but must have external causes. So what about, and I've already defended the second premise, so the conclusion follows. But why must the conclusion be God? The conclusion, the cause of the universe has to be spaceless, because space came into being and did not exist until this cause brought it into existence. The cause cannot be a spatial being. It must be spaceless or non-spatial. You cannot be inside of something if you are that something's cause. You cannot be inside of something if that something did not exist before you brought it into existence. The builder of a house, for example, cannot be inside of the house prior to building it, since the house didn't exist before he brought it into existence. It must be timeless, because time did not exist until the Big Bang. The cause cannot be inside of time. It must be immaterial. Why? Because material objects cannot exist unless space exists. Material objects have mass and therefore occupy spatial dimensions. If there is no space, matter cannot exist. This means that because the cause is non-spatial, it is therefore non-material. It must be unimaginably powerful, because it created all matter, energy, space, and time out of nothing. I can't imagine anything that would have to be more powerful than that. It must be personal, for 3 reasons, but I only have enough time to give 1 reason. 1 reason is that it's an entailment of the cause's immateriality. There are 2 types of things recognized by philosophers that are immaterial. Either abstract objects, like numbers, sets, or other mathematical entities, or unembodied minds. Philosophers realize that if abstract objects exist, they exist as non-physical entities. However, abstract objects can't produce any effect. That's part of what it means to be abstract. The number 3 isn't going to be producing any effects anytime soon. Given that abstract objects are causally impotent, it therefore follows that an unembodied mind is the cause of the universe's beginning. And this unembodied mind must also be uncaused, because that's an entailment of its timelessness. It has to, you can't, so anyway, of course, various attempts have been proposed over the decades to try to avoid an absolute beginning, but rather than critique any of those models, since I have no time left, I'm just going to leave the critique of those models for the discussion period. And that ends my time.
All right. Yeah. Well, turn it over to David Johnson now.
Okay. First of all, thank you for inviting me onto the show. Thank you for that opening statement. Forgive me if this sounds a little flip, but I don't actually care about any of that. So I don't think that any of that actually follows logically one on another. And so to save time, I will just tell you what my strategy for the conversation is up front. I think just to have a little fun with it, and because I've never done it before, I'm going to grant the Kalam cosmological argument. I'm going to grant the 2 syllogisms in the conclusion and just see where it goes from there, because I contend that it can be granted fairly casually, and your effort to get from there to a God is simply impossible. That said, since I do have a couple of minutes, don't worry, I'm not going to take my full 10 minutes. So I didn't mind you going a bit over your time. Just to be sure, I actually think I could dispute all of the premises of the Kalam. At the very least, I don't think that the premises can be proven. So you mentioned early on infinite density. I think that was the term you used, correct? For something to be infinitely dense, there has to be something that's dense, something being compacted or compressed to form that density. And so it does not, in fact, follow that if you rewind the clock further and further back, you end up with nothing. We can talk about the process when it's rewound back to, say, the size of a period at the end of a sentence. We cannot talk about the process before that. And so it is a leap and an assumption that it was nothing before that. But if, in fact, you say it was infinitely dense, then there had to be something to form that density. That doesn't really follow for me. As far as the philosophical arguments of, well, you know, you can't, infinites don't make sense in a materialistic kind of way. Well, I would say that you have the same problem when you posit your God. Infinite doesn't make sense for him either. You're dealing with the same set of circumstances. You're just putting God as the material as opposed to something else. And so I don't think that you get anywhere with that either. I'm not going to sit on any of that too long, though, because I'm not a professional philosopher. I am certainly not a scientist, and I respect my interlocutor, but I don't think he's a professional scientist either, after listening to his opening argument. And so what I really want to do is see if we can't build that theological bridge from the end of the Kalam that I will just, for fun and for the remainder of the time, grant. And let's see if we can get to that William Lane Craig addendum that he put in there, which I think is impossible to do. So what say you, Christian? What happens if we grant the Kalam? How do you get me from things have a cause to that cause has to be God? And I heard what you were saying there before, and I will do some rebutting there a little bit. But that's the gauntlet that I want to throw down.
All right. So, Evan, is that it? That's everything, David?
That's all I need for now.
All right. So I guess we'll just jump into a dialogue, because I don't really think a rebuttal is necessary. You laid down a challenge, and I think it's up to Evan to respond, and then you guys can go back and forth.
I kind of would like to give a rebuttal. I don't think it would take me nearly as long as my opening statement.
Okay, yeah. If you want to give something short, so you guys can actually start discussing it.
Yeah, I mean.
Yeah, because I was also feeling like right then you like your time cut off right when you were trying to build the bridge. So kind of if you want to.
Yeah, I was.
Yeah, and if you want to go back and maybe rehabilitate the whole infinite density thing, or somehow prove that you're not making a logical leap, that if you go back far enough, you end up with nothing.
Okay, so is my rebuttal time starting now?
Yeah. Just go ahead, man. I set you guys on, so like if you're done rebutting, you guys can just go back and forth from there.
Okay, so I'll start. First, how do we get to God from the cause? If you grant the three conclusions, how do you get to the cause? Whatever begins to exist has a cause. The universe began to exist, therefore the universe has a cause. And so what's the connect between that statement, the universe has a cause, and God? Well, this is what I was trying to rapid fire, like an auctioneer, spit out near the beginning of my opening statement. And it probably, I would really love to go into this a lot slower so that maybe you and the audience can actually understand what I'm saying without having to play it on half speed. There are very good, positive, logical reasons for why the cause must be at least something very conceptually similar to God. You don't have to call it God if you don't want to, but at least
I mean,
everybody who would agree with this description would say, gosh, that looks a lot like God. Well, I've said the cause must be spaceless because space came into being and did not exist until the cause brought it into existence.
I'm sorry. Let me just get some clarification before you go on. Are you saying the cause is God or that it's something like God? Because these are very different things. God is not just a concept. God is a person, a particular person in mythology.
Okay, well, okay, let me finish with my rebuttal period. But I would say just quickly that given the I always mess this up. Is it the indiscernibility of identity, the identity of indiscernibles, that I would infer that the cause of the universe and God are one and the same. And I've written extensively on this in my published work, The Case for the One True God, and in various blog articles. So the cause must be a spaceless being. The space came into being, there was no space before it Big Banged into existence, so the cause cannot be spatial. It must be non-spatial. You can't be inside of something if you are that something's cause, just as the builder of a house cannot be inside of the house prior to building it. It must be a timeless cause because time did not exist until the cause started the clock. Can't be inside. It can't be inside of time. Must be a timeless being. It must be immaterial. Why? Because material objects cannot exist unless space exists. Material objects are made of matter, protons, neutrons, particles. They have mass. They therefore occupy spatial dimensions. If there is no space, matter cannot exist. So this means that because the cause is non-spatial, it is therefore non-material. It must be unimaginably powerful because it created all matter, energy, space, and time out of nothing. Anything that has the ability to spawn universes has to be enormously powerful.
Where do you get that from?
It must be supernatural because and this is a good argument that Tim Stratton brings up in his Kalam blog post, because nature and the universe are synonyms. Nature did not to say that the universe began to exist is synonymous with saying that nature began to exist. So if nature began to exist, then the cause of nature cannot be natural, because the cause is by definition beyond nature. To say otherwise would be to spout incoherence. You'd basically be saying nature caused nature to come into being. It must be uncaused, given that the cause of the universe is timeless. It cannot have a beginning to its existence. To have a beginning to one's existence entails a before and an after. There's a time before one existed and a time after one came into existence. But a before and after of anything is impossible without time. Since the cause created time, the cause therefore cannot have a beginning. It's beginningless. It must be personal, and one of the reasons I gave was that this is an entailment of the cause's immateriality. There are two things that philosophers realize could be abstract, immaterial, either abstract objects or unembodied minds. Abstract objects are causally impotent. The number 7 isn't going to cause anything, so that means it must be an unembodied mind. So a spaceless, timeless, immaterial, uncaused, enormously powerful, supernatural, unembodied mind brought the universe into being. You don't have to call that God if you don't want to, but as Shakespeare once said, a rose by any other name smells just as sweet. Now, what about the argument that you cannot?
Hang on.
Yeah,
okay,
I was gonna enter in. Yeah, I was gonna enter in here. All right. So, Evan, you had 5 minutes there for a quick rebuttal. We're putting out a lot of material, and I think it's fair that we go, through it a bit at a time. So, I'm gonna shift it over to David because I'm sure he's got a lot of questions, or should I say David Johnson has a lot of questions to that first part of your rebuttal, and we can take it by segment if you don't mind, because it's a lot easier like that.
Maybe we could just have a little bit of conversation here, because I mean, you're not only are you quoting William Lane Craig, but you're using the William Lane Craig approach of just shotgun claims. Shotgun claims an hour. I don't have time to go back and rebuttal every claim in there, and a lot of these are just baseless, and I don't know where to begin really. But I think I would like to just pick one and say uncaused. What does that mean, that the cause is uncaused?
It means that it's beginningless. It never came into being. It just always was.
All right, but let's just call it God for the moment. Not sure why we should, but let's do that. If God was always here, an infinite set of goes, right? The thing that you say is impossible without God. I don't know why it's more possible with God, but that doesn't mean that the universe was uncaused, because at some point in God's infinite past, he had to have the thought, I want to create a universe. Okay, and so we can say, well, what caused that? There's a cause there. Why would God want to create a universe? Well, we might say, well, God was lonely, or he was unhappy with his triune company. Well, what caused that? You see, there's always a cause. And so uncaused is one of those words that's kind of meaningless when you look at it carefully. So I don't necessarily agree with your assertion that the universe had to be created by an uncaused cause. That's kind of a word salad that doesn't mean anything.
Okay, well, first I gave some positive reasons for why the cause of the universe had to have the list of attributes I gave, and you really haven't interacted with any of them.
You didn't give any reasons. You just made claims. You just said it has to be this, it's that, it has to be this, it has to be that.
No, I gave reasons for why it had to be this and that and this and that. But let me go on to say, why did God want to create the universe? Okay, that's an interesting theological question, but it has no bearing on whether the Kalam Cosmological Argument is a formally and informally valid argument. In order for an argument to be sound, it needs to meet three criteria. It has to have valid logic. It has to either follow modus ponens, modus tollens, hypothetical syllogism, or any of the 9 rules of inference. It has to have true premises, and we have to have good reasons to affirm those premises. And right. I've given some arguments for why those 3 premises are true. So,
I'm providing a counter of why your first premises of uncaused simply isn't true.
So wait a minute. Why God wanted to create the universe? What motives did he have? That's just irrelevant. Also, you seem to be misunderstanding
not irrelevant
if
there was a cause that acted on God to create the universe.
But you also you're saying that God had a decision before he created the universe, and I'm thinking here that you're trying to say that it's incoherent because there was something that occurred before the first moment of time. Is that correct?
It is incoherent.
Okay,
yes.
Okay, so I've thought a lot about this, and I think that there's actually a very good response to this. I think that it would only be incoherent if you are committed assuming that God's decision to create and God's actions are occurring in that sequence. First you have God deciding, I'm going to make a universe, and then he uses his omnipotent power, and boom, the Big Bang occurs. Now that would be a contradiction. That would be incoherent. I totally agree. You would have a first event before the first event, and that makes no sense. But who said that the events have to take place sequentially? it seems to me that all of these, that God's decision to create, God's acting to create, and the creation all occurred simultaneously. It seems to me that God could have decided to create a universe, and in that very moment, God acted, and in that very moment, time began. The universe.
When you say in that very moment, you were speaking temporally.
Yeah,
you're speaking temporally. In that very moment.
Yes, I am, because
God. That means that God is experiencing time in His frame. It may not be our frame, but it is time, and that means that there was before that moment. But let me move past that, because uncaused still is a non sequitur for me. If you say that this God is the very first mover and the very first being, there is nothing stopping this God from creating other realms and other beings that themselves could have created this space-time universe. And so, again, there's nothing about this universe that says it has to be the direct product of the earliest uncaused. Even if that was a concept that made any sense, you cannot, within your framework, prove that this universe has to be the product of that. It could be the product of many generations from that first causer and first mover.
Many religious sects think that, but that doesn't help your atheism. Maybe you should become a Mormon or Jehovah's Witness, but you're still it doesn't do anything. But I would say that Occam's razor would say, Occam's razor is the scientific principle that says you should not multiply causes beyond what is necessary to explain the phenomena. If all we need is one creator, one spaceless, timeless, immaterial, powerful, uncreated creator, then that is the only thing we should posit. God may have created a demigod, a junior god that created the universe, for all we know, just based on this argument alone and considering nothing else. But
right, but your argument is saying it must be the first causer, and that is wrong on the face of it. There is no must be. So it could very well be the work of someone near infinite generations removed from your theoretical first cause. There's nothing about the Kalam that says it has to be an uncaused mover.
Okay, so are you going to become a Mormon or Jehovah's Witness? Because what you're describing,
my life choices are none of your business. What is your business is that your argument, the argument that you are proposing, it's also not Christianity.
But it does posit God. It does posit a creation.
Let me jump in here.
That's not helping. You're saying, oh well, it could be. He could have created. It could have been Yahweh's great grandson that created the universe. Okay.
Where did Yahweh come in? Yahweh might be one of the demigods.
But yeah.
Okay.
Let's move on. Let's move on to that, because I think we've kind of exhausted this one. Yeah. So Evan, do you have any response to anything he said early on, especially about that the infinite density and so forth?
Oh yeah. I was going to get to that. But he said that it was an assumption that because we trace the expansion of the universe down to infinite density, that it's an assumption to say that we can just go beyond that and the universe does not exist. To me, that's an inference. I mean, why think that the buck stops there? And moreover, if the universe existed forever in just a teeny tiny dot of a dense state, why did it just happen to begin to exist a finite time ago?
If God existed infinitely in his satisfied state, why would he suddenly create the universe?
Hey,
stop interrupting me.
Let him respond first, David, and then we'll get your thought as soon as he's done with his point, and then you guys could go back and forth that way.
So William Lane Craig gives a very good illustration to say that look, if you've got all of the necessary and sufficient conditions in place for an effect to come about, and the cause is past eternal, then why is the effect not eternal as well? Actually, this was one of the arguments I planned on giving in defense of the personhood of the universe's cause, but I didn't get to it. But I think it would apply to a little tiny dot of a universe too. And Craig gives this illustration. He says to imagine a lake that has existed from eternity past. The temperature has been below 32 degrees from eternity past. Now, it would be impossible for the water to just begin to freeze a finite time ago. If the lake had existed from eternity past and it had been below 32 degrees from eternity past, the water would be frozen from eternity past. This is because the necessary and sufficient conditions for the water to be frozen, the water and below 32 degrees Fahrenheit, they were both present from eternity past. So now the only way that you can have an eternal cause but an effect that is finite in duration is if the cause is a personal agent. And here William Lane Craig gives an illustration of a man who is sitting from eternity. He's just sitting there from eternity past, and then all of a sudden he freely wills to stand up, and his standing up is an effect produced by him, the cause. So you have a temporal effect arising from an eternal cause.
So, David, what do you think about that?
Yeah.
Yeah, let's answer that.
I think it's bunk. If God existed from eternity past, let's say from the all of the moments before he created the universe, just using the kind of specious logic that was presented in the introduction, we would never get to the moment of creation because of the infinite moments past that God existed before creation. So
Okay.
that argument defeats God as well as anything else. I think it's probably a bad argument. That is my intuition for it, but it certainly doesn't. It doesn't help the God theory, but hurt the nature theory. It's the same on both sides.
Okay, Evan, what do you think about that? I'll just kind of jump in between here so we can moderate a little bit.
Yeah, it's just not true that God has endured through an infinite number of past moments. Before God, sans creation, existed in a state of timelessness. And this is not just conjecture on my part. This is what scientists are saying. You can read statements by Stephen Hawking that say that time began to exist at the Big Bang. Well, that means that if God exists beyond the universe, at least, I hold William Lane Craig's view that God entered into time once he created the universe, but at least sans creation, he was timeless. So it's just not true that God endured through an infinite number of
what that
past moments.
Hold on.
That is not the conclusion, though.
Hold on. Evan, just finish that last piece and we'll have David respond.
Okay, so I was saying that God's sans creation was timeless, and I can, if I could look for sources from very famous and very well-respected cosmologists that say that time began to exist at the Big Bang. So it's just not true that God endured through an infinite number of past moments. Timelessness is not enduring through an infinite number of past moments by definition.
Okay, so David, what do you say to that?
Right, you're conflating time frames. So I have no problem with saying that our time frame, our space-time continuum began at a certain moment. But even if you posit a creator that's outside of that time frame, you don't necessarily come to a place where there's no time frame, where there's no space-time. For instance, God, we have the Bible talking about heaven as a location, and it has what we would think of as time, because God is in that location marking the time that we have now. So he may be in another space and in another time, and just because our time frame started at a particular point, that doesn't mean that that's where his time frame started, or that doesn't mean that he is without time. So it's specious to say that he is timeless simply because our time started.
Well, that's very interesting, and I wanted to jump in here because I've never heard this in a Kalam debate. I have heard a lot of things, but I haven't heard it quite like this, and it's pretty feisty. You guys are doing great. But I do want to ask Evan here to respond to the heaven location plus time. What would you say to that, Evan?
Yeah, I know that it's popular. I hear it a lot among preachers and pastors. They talk about heaven being a timeless state. There's just nothing in the Bible that would indicate that there is no time in heaven. That is, I don't know where that assumption came from, that preachers make this statement. It probably came from Augustine. I mean, a lot of bad ideas came from Augustine. But there's just nothing in the Bible that says heaven is in a state of timelessness. Now, yes, God is in heaven, but God is everywhere. The Bible teaches that God is omnipresent. Just read Psalm 139. The psalmist is like, I could go here and I could go there and I could go to the depths of Sheol. I could go to the heights of heaven. No matter where I go, you're going to be there. So yeah,
I think the point is being missed though. So let's make an analogy. Let's just say that we here together cooperatively make a universe, that we create a space-time continuum in our laboratory right now. So that time starts now. And the people in that universe might one day posit that, there was a point before their time and their creators must be timeless. But no, their creators aren't timeless. Their creators are us. We are in our space-time continuum. So there's nothing to suggest that God is not in a space-time continuum wherever he is. There's nothing to necessitate that this universe has to be spawned from something that is spaceless or timeless, any more than a universe that we create would be spawned from something spaceless or timeless.
So are you saying that God basically exists in like a hyper-time dimension that exists separate from our time?
It's among all things possible if your God exists at all. I don't see it doesn't make any sense to suggest that he's timeless. We don't have any examples of that.
So do you have any evidence that there's a hyper-time dimension beyond our universe?
Do you have any evidence that there is no time before our time? That there's no dimension outside of our dimension? If I read my Bible correctly, there are a number of dimensions. Christians talk about the third heaven, second heaven, first heaven.
But that's not the same as saying that there's. But that's not the same as saying that's not saying that there are other dimensions. Is not saying that there are other that they exist. But those
aren't a part of this creation. And so what I am saying, once again, there is no necessity that simply because you can say this space-time continuum had a beginning, that there was no space-time continuum that it wasn't spawned from. So if God is there, I don't see why he wouldn't be in a space-time continuum. And if you say that he is eternal from a time past, then that does kind of indicate some kind of space-time continuum. And if the problems of infinite regress, that he could never get to the moment of that we could never get to a certain moment because of all the infinite moments in the past, that would equally apply to God.
All right, Evan, let me see if I'm understanding you guys correctly here. So, David, you're kind of saying that we got more or less kind of the same problem, right? If even if we posit God, you've still got the infinite moments problem, right?
Yes.
Okay. And so if I'm understanding Evan correctly, then Evan, you basically would say that, you don't have that problem because you've got God existing in a timeless state. And so then that his decision to create happens at the same, like at the moment of creation, right?
Right.
Okay. And I think that is where the main point of contention is coming. David, you're saying though that something would have to still cause God to create, and so that implies that there is still time before. If you say that
he's infinite in time infinite in reverse, then we are in fact correct in asking, well, what was God doing before creation?
Well, it's a good thing I'm not saying that then.
Well, I understand that. Well, you're not saying that now. You were kind of saying that a while ago, that God is infinite in time.
No, I wasn't.
So
are you saying that God
then,
had a beginning?
No, I'm saying that God existed in a state of timelessness, and that precludes having a beginning or an end.
Okay, so how do you get that God was in a state of timelessness?
Well, I infer that on the basis of the fact that
do you believe that the universe?
All of the best scientists that I know and respect say that time had to begin. Look,
Wait a minute. I'm sorry.
Whoa. Quote,
the best scientists don't say anything about God's timelessness.
They say if you would not interrupt me, you might understand what I'm saying.
Evan, finish the thought there, Evan, and then we're going to jump on to probably about one more topic there, and then we'll wrap it up.
Okay, so Stephen Hawking, in his book The Beginning of Time, he says, quote, "The conclusion of this lecture is that the universe has not existed forever. Rather, the universe and time itself had a beginning in the Big Bang about 15 billion years ago," end quote. That's just one example. Time had a begin. Terry Hartner of Cornell University says, quote, the present location and velocities of galaxies are a result of a primordial blast known as the Big Bang. It marked the beginning of the universe, the beginning of time. Now, if time had a beginning at the Big Bang, the cause of the universe has to be timeless. You can't be inside of time if time began at the Big Bang.
Space-time. If I created a pocket of space-time right now, that would be the beginning of time in that pocket of space-time. But it doesn't mean that I am outside of time. I am in my own pocket of space-time. So once again, you are stating emphatically that the universe must have been created by someone who is outside of any kind of temporal frame. And that is simply not true. That does not follow philosophically. It doesn't follow theologically. It doesn't follow. That's just a bald, a wild claim.
What you're saying that there could be some like hyper time outside of our universe. So because I threw this logical possibility out there, it's up to you to prove me wrong. You atheists do this all the time. What evidence do you have that there is time?
I'm sorry, are you not positing a being that is timeless, spaceless, materialless?
Yes,
I think you guys.
That to me is indistinguishable from nothing.
Well,
so
I think
I'm at least positing something that we know exists, which is space-time.
I think I'm hearing that you guys both have problems with each other's hypothesis here. Does that sound correct, Paulman?
That sounds about right to me. I was kind of wondering on like this issue of the infinite thing. It sounds to me like David's saying that you could have sort of like a beginning to our time, but it would have had to start in another time. And what my question on that is, and Evan, I don't know if this is the route you want to go with this, but what I would be thinking of that is, even if you have another sort of time wherein the present time began from that time, doesn't that time itself still have to be finite? And however many times you want to trace that back, doesn't problems with infinity and stuff still arise from that?
Yeah, I would say so. I would say that in any time, if you want to posit a hyper time, that's actually a very good point. That would just push the infinite regress problem back. That time had to have a start, and so you would have to posit something beyond that time.
Yeah, so you're kind of like you're like talking. Yeah, like you're trying to say that. Yeah, and you're kind of talking about the whole William Lane Craig when he talks about the multiverse. It runs into that infinite regress problem too. David, what is your thought, Mr. Johnson?
Yeah, I don't care about the infinite regress problem because neither side solves it. So if you can, first of all, I don't consider it a problem. But if you consider it a problem, you have to solve it, right? And you don't solve it by simply inventing a God and saying, okay, that's it, I'm not going to look anymore. So, I mean, I know that we're out of time and you wanted to move on to one more thing, but one of the things that's in this list of Craigian claims is changeless. It has to be changeless. What? Why? I don't even understand how a changeless being could create, because he's changeless. And the act of creation is in and of itself an act of radical change. So once again, it sounds like one of these just
Well, that's something Craig said. I never bring up that because I think it's rather superfluous to the debate. I don't think it's
well, Craig
Craig
says it's necessary. So I don't know. I studied the Kalam and I studied the Craigian edition. So and you've been working off of Craig's notes. So you think that Craig is wrong here?
Well, I think that I think what Craig is saying, and I think this is the same thing that he says about God's timelessness, is that God was timeless without creation, but in time since creation. And I think that's what Craig would say about his changelessness too. Outside of time, you can't have change. Once time starts, then you can have change. And I think that, you know, this goes into the divine immutability debate, and it gets outside of the Kalam debate and into theological waters.
It almost sounds like God didn't exist.
He has a very specific, like on his defenders class. He has an understanding of changelessness that he gets from J.I. Packer's book, Knowing God, and it's not that I know that there are some views of divine immutability out there that are really bizarre. They are so extreme that, like you, I agree. I don't know how they not render God like a cosmic statue that can't do anything. But there are more modest versions of immutability that says he's immutable in some ways and mutable. He's inchangeable in some ways and changeable in others. And you know, going from not being the creator of the universe to being the creator of the universe would be one of those things that he's changeable in, that relationship that he has to the universe.
All right, David, let's let you respond to that. Then I'll give you both a couple minutes to kind of wrap up, give your closing thoughts, and we're going to start winding down, all right?
Earlier, Evan was saying that, you know, God's thought for creating the universe and his action of creating the universe, it was all kind of happened at the same time. But I'm still stuck on the idea of, yeah, but what was he doing before that? And you can say, well, but there was no before that. But that doesn't make any sense. If there was no before that, then the universe has always existed because God has always created it. Because that's the only thing he did. There was no before God created the universe. So it does make God kind of seem like he went from two states, infinite, from infinite changelessness to, I got to do something. And so that doesn't really make any sense. I don't think that any of your proposals for solving the regress problem actually work for your side, but don't work for mine. I think it doesn't work for either side. Now, once again, I don't think that infinite regress is a problem that needs solving. I don't feel any existential angst about it. And I think that if it can be solved, I don't think we're anywhere close to it by positing a God who, you know, who says abracadabra and makes a universe when he's been, you know, standing there for eons past doing nothing.
Okay.
All right.
Is it closing statement time?
Yep. It sure
Okay.
is.
So I am still convinced that the Kalam is sound. I was expecting some more powerful responses to the Kalam tonight that I never encountered. I encountered some fairly weak ones, but there was one aspect, something that my opponent brought up that I never had a chance to talk about, and I'd like to include that in my closing statement, and that is that the argument that if you cannot traverse an actually infinite number of events, or if actual infinites cannot exist, well, then that's a problem for the Christian theist, because we say that God is infinite, right? So if infinites cannot exist, then wouldn't that mean that God cannot exist, or that at least God has to be a finite being? Well, I don't think so. To say God is infinite simply means that he is the greatest being conceivable. He has all properties, and this gets into another natural theology argument that I'm not going to talk about at all, because that's not what this debate is about. It's called the modal ontological argument, and it says that God has all properties that would make a person great, and he has these properties to the greatest extent possible. He is a maximally great being. And so to say God is infinitely powerful simply means to say that there is nothing God is incapable of doing, except for that which is logically incoherent, like creating square circles, married bachelors, rocks too heavy for him to lift. However, as C.S. Lewis pointed out, there is no such thing as the logically impossible. Words like square circle and married bachelors are just meaningless combinations of words, so that God's inability to make a square circle no more undermines his omnipotence than his inability to answer the question, would a squealabot polycop look better on a triangular pookie than a round babblewhack undermine his omniscience? God's omnipotence is not composed of an actually infinite number of things. It's a qualitative infinite, not a quantitative infinite, like past moments would be in an eternal universe. Likewise, to say God is omnipresent just simply means that there is no place that exists where he is not. God's infinite presence is likewise qualitative and quantitative. And what about God's eternality? Well, this would only imply a quantitative infinite if one asserts, like Mr. Johnson seems to really want to assert, that God endured through an infinite number of past temporal moments. However, both the scientific and I would say the biblical evidence, but that's not relevant in this debate, indicates that God was a timeless being sans the creation of the universe. Even if God entered into time, as philosophers like William Lane Craig hold, that would only mean that God endured through 14 billion years, not an infinite number of moments. And God's infinite goodness is just his moral perfection. He's sinless, he's never done anything wrong, and never will. So when we talk about God being infinite, it's a qualitative infinite, not a quantitative infinite, and therefore it doesn't run into the problems that an eternal universe would.
All right, David.
Okay, thank you for having me on the show again. I appreciate that. Cosmological argument. The Kalam Cosmological Argument, anything that begins to exist has a cause. The universe has a cause. The universe began to exist. I granted that up front, just to see where we would go. Where we went is where the argument must go. Just an endless loop of unprovable, unsubstantiated claim after claim after claim. And if you want to see the inevitable weakness of this argument, by the time we get to the end of it in my interlocutor's closing argument, he abandons the argument altogether and goes to the ontological argument, hoping to find some solace there. There is no solace in the ontological argument either. You can just keep throwing up arguments and claims all you want, but here's the Craigian addendum. If we followed the Kalam cosmological argument to the next level, he says the universe has a cause. If the universe has a cause, is the second statement. If the universe has a cause, then an uncaused, I've already shown that the universe didn't need an uncaused creator. Personal creator, we didn't talk about personal, of the universe exists who without the universe is beginningless. We show that he doesn't have to be beginningless. He could have been born 1,000 times over and then created the universe. Changeless. He doesn't have to be changeless. He could have changed 1,000,000 times and then created the universe. Immortal. He doesn't have to be immortal. He could have created the universe and died. Timeless, spaceless, enormously powerful. We didn't get to enormously powerful, but we've seen in several of those descriptions, none of that is philosophically necessary, even if you posit a God. This is just claim after baseless claim after baseless claim. And when that's shown, maybe we can confuse with the ontological argument long enough to show that we don't have a God yet. All we have are about 45 minutes of claims. We don't even have an argument. I didn't argue the ontological argument. I granted it. And where did we get to? Ontological, really? So yeah, great. I'm not a physicist. And I'm not a great philosopher, but I don't think that this level of the cosmological argument requires that. I would say for anyone who would like a deeper dive into the cosmological argument, my friend Dale Glover is working on some fairly extensive work on the cosmological argument, and that would be good for both Christians and skeptics to look at. You can find more about him at Real Seeker Ministry. Thank you for that time.
Yep.
And we're going to have Evan's work, his own books. We'll have that in a link in the description for anyone who wants to see, his argument on that in writing. So we'll have links to his books as well as to Skeptics and Seekers, where you can check out both of our guests' work there. And so, yes, please help them out and support them. David?
Yep. Just very, very honored to have you both on. It was fun, feisty. Sometimes we get a little feisty in these conversations, and we love it. So, but yeah, guys, thanks for coming on, and we hope to have you again sometime.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having me.
All right.
Thanks for being on.
All right, look, I'm gonna duck out and